Hello, everyone, and welcome back to my channel. And you are in for quite a treat today. I will be interviewing Reverend Canon Professor Alison Milbank. She is a professor of English literature and theology at the University of Nottingham. And the collision of those two, I think, will be just really especially interesting for our conversation. And she is also an Anglican priest and canon theologian. So thank you, Alison, for being willing to take the time to do this talk.
It's a pleasure to be with you.
So I guess we could kind of start back at the beginning. Can you remember your introduction to Victorian literature, your first experiences with it?
Well, it was when I was about 7. And in those days, they used to give children Blackie's children's novels. And they were slightly shortened, mainly Victorian novels. And I was given Villette, which is not really a novel for 7-year-olds. And Wuthering Heights I had, and some Dickens, but I was particularly keen on the Brontes when I was little. And we used to act out Wuthering Heights in the playground with another child.
That is fabulous. Yeah, I feel the Brontes have very pulpy plots and their writing is particularly accessible. Yeah, I think they could be a good kind of starting point with Victorian literature.
I mean, it is also very kind of biblical, but I was a child brought up with the prayer book and the authorized version of the Bible. I'm quite old, so this meant that I could actually make sense of the kind of biblical analogies they use. I mean, at one point, Lucy Snow in Villette talks about putting a nail through her head, like the nail put through, by jail through the head of Sisera. You'd have to know your Old Testament to get what on earth she's talking about.
Wow, that's very interesting. I know it was kind of nice to have the context for in Tess of the D'Urbervilles, when Alec d'Urberville is kind of telling Tess that she should be with him. He references, I think, it's the Old Testament book that it's all symbolism about someone being married to a prostitute.
Oh yes, it'll be Hosea.
Yes, and my friends and I were reading Tess of the D'Urbervilles, and I explained to them, like, it's so insulting that he references himself like Hosea, because it's all supposed to be a picture of Christ, and from everything that he has done, he's so deplorable, just to this very, terrible misinterpretation then for him to use that to have the upper hand.
And it's almost as if he's behaving as she's a kind of burden.
Yes.
Taken on as a kind of prophetic action in the book of prophecy.
Yes. Yeah, it just shows you how twisted his thinking is.
Yeah.
So then, now, as you've read a fair amount of Victorian literature, what are some favorites that pop out to you?
Well, I still have a great love for Villette, which is less immediately everybody's favorite than Jane Eyre, but I still love it. I mean, the ones that people don't always register how brilliant it is Uncle Silas by Sheridan Le Fanu.
That is not one I hear talked about a lot at all.
No, it is in print. There's a World's Classics edition, and possibly a Penguin still, and it's an absolutely fantastic Gothic novel in the first person. And it's one of the most intense portrayals of a young girl dealing with a mysterious world where she can't trust anything that I know. And it's very, very powerful, very, very frightening, and very, very heartwarming. It's full of kind of female friendship, It's very poetic. It is very theological. And I think it's one of the great Victorian novels. And every time I taught it, I used to teach it when I taught in America years ago at the University of Virginia. It became then the students' favorite book. They loved
Wow.
it when we did it. So I really recommend it to people.
Yes. Oh, and that is interesting to hear too about the female friendship in it. That's kind of one of my that as an element in a book, it will definitely elevate it even more for me. And so then I guess you did talk about Uncle Silas, but are there any that you think are underrated? Maybe that,
Well,
aren't talked about quite as much.
nobody really reads Meredith anymore. And I think The Egoist and Diana of the Crossways are both very great novels. I don't know why he's fallen out of fashion,
I,
but he
yeah,
seems to have.
yeah, I know. My friend Katie from Books and Things, the channel, and the creator of Victober, she really loves The Egoist. But she has found, I think she thinks in comparison to other Victorian novels, it might be a little bit, I don't know, harder to get through. But it's one of those that has really made an impact on her. And now she's so happy that she has read it. And I feel like I was just reading about, isn't Diana of the Crossways inspired by Caroline Norton?
Yes, there are elements of Caroline Norton's sort of biography in it. And there are sort of ambiguities in relation to the female figure. She's not a conventional Victorian heroine, and she's very independent. And she does get into trouble with the patriarchy, as you might say. But it's very fair-minded and subtle and interesting, and it doesn't fall into any kind of sort of easy. It's not sort of that you just read it off as a feminist novel or anything like that. It's quite subtle and interesting. I really recommend it.
And then what is it in particular about The Egoist that you think makes it special?
I think the analysis of the main character, the kind of critique of him, and the way that he becomes an egoist is just brilliantly observed.
Very nice. Oh yeah, it's one of those that it's on my list of Victorian novels I would love to read, but I keep being intimidated by it. So I think I should just get a copy and take it slowly and enjoy it and savor it.
Yeah, I don't know if anybody reads Charlotte Young anymore. She was hugely popular in the Victorian period. She was an Oxford Movement novelist, John Keeble's protege. So she's High Church Anglican, and she writes these family stories where you get a really strong sense of the kind of internal life of a big family. And The Heir of Redcliffe is the most famous. But many of them, there are large numbers of them, and they're very easy to read, and quite moving and interesting. In to again, female friendship is a big theme, and
yes,
friendships within families when you have these big families, and the role of education, and no, they're very good. Was a student recently who spent some time with me who was working at the University of Madrid, and she was doing a PhD on Charlotte Young,
really,
which is now completed, I'm glad to say. But I think it was the first one since whenever.
Yes, actually, I have really fallen in love with Charlotte Young's writing. And my first book was The Heir of Redcliffe. And I heard about The Heir of Redcliffe, I think, because Jo March reads it in Little Women.
Yes.
She's found crying and eating apples and reading The Heir of Redcliffe.
She's pretty sad.
Yes. And then one that I really enjoyed was called Heart's Ease. And that one is, I mean, it's got all the typical Charlotte Mary Young features. But one thing that made it interesting is that one of the brothers in the family gets married, and they have all prejudged this young child bride. That's basically what she is. I think she's 16. On her 16th birthday, they get married. And it's all about how she can really surprise them and takes them by surprise. And that one's really fun. Now, what's interesting is there's a category of, in homeschooling circles, and I homeschool my boys, category of books involving history called living history books. And so it's kind of not necessarily textbooks. And they think kind of if you read that sort of book, it can maybe make historical events stick more. And I've seen The Little Duke by Charlotte Young on several lists. So that's one I hope to read with my boys at some point.
Yeah, I mean, they do give you a very strong picture of domestic life and religious life in the Victorian period, as does the novels of Margaret Oliphant. She wrote a great many novels, but I'm particularly fond of the Carlingford novels, which are the ones set in this little imaginary town, particularly among the clergy, but not just the clergy. There's the doctor's family, there's Hester, there's Phoebe, Major, they're quite broad. And I would have thought if anybody was looking for a way to give people an insight into Victorian England, she is brilliant for that purpose, because she gives you a range of different classes and different church backgrounds. She's got one about chapel life of the free churches. And they're very, very good, I think.
And is the free churches, does that kind of be more broadly evangelical churches?
Not particularly. It's more, I'm trying to remember, it's more kind of congregational, Presbyterian, probably congregational. No, I don't think evangelicalism was very big in Victorian small towns. The evangelical movement's particularly strong at the beginning of the century. And Mr. Bronte Sr. was a fruit of it. Henry Martin, the great evangelical clergyman in Cambridge, was responsible for his education, I think, and his conversion. And although you get another revival in 1906, I would have said the free churches were more rationalistic in the middle of the 19th century.
Okay, very interesting. I actually am very leisurely making my way through the Perpetual Curate. And the ants in that really make me think of like Bertie Wooster's ants in P.G. Woodhouse's books.
Aunt calls to aunt across the primeval swamp, he says.
Yes, so those are making me laugh a lot. And I do love, it is very kind of slice of life is a category that people say. It's very
yes, I mean, that one's very much about a conversion to Roman Catholicism.
Yeah.
And all
I did not know that.
Give up.
That's very interesting.
The kind of sacrifice that has to be made, which is huge.
Yes. Yeah, to be in Victorian England and to become a Roman Catholic was no small decision. Well, then I guess I was wondering if you knew, in your experience kind of teaching Victorian literature, have you found any common misunderstandings that people might have about it?
Well, one of my big beefs, which I took on in my first book, was still the sort of way in which people think that the angel of the house is a woman. The angel of the house is love, in a poem by Coventry Patmore. And I still think that people are far too kind of negative and quick to assume that all Victorian heroines are these kind of angelic beings who are necessarily confined by the domestic space, In fact, my whole first book was arguing that, in fact, the association of the woman and the house, which is sometimes made, is often a liberating thing, and a mode of critique, sometimes social critique. So I even try and rehabilitate Esther Summerson in Bleak House by Dickens, for example, and argue that she can be thought of as quite a radical figure. And so it always gets me when people, you know, they have this very kind of negative view about women in the Victorian fiction.
Yeah, and looking at it by the standards of today, to not see, you know, kind of what would have been radical for that time period, like you said.
Yes, and even whether our radicalism is as radical as their radicalism.
Yes, that's very interesting to think about. Yeah, Esther is a character that I do love. But I guess when I think about kind of Gaskell's women, or George Eliot's, they to me are generally more interesting than a number of Dickens female characters, although in Our Mutual Friend and Damian Son, and they're definitely interesting in Great Expectations.
I suppose we have to remember that Dickens is not writing realist fiction in the mode of Gaskell and Eliot. He's writing romance and texts that are quite kind of mythical. So you're not going to get the same modes of characterization that you will get in something like Middlemarch. It's just not what he's doing. And so they will disappoint. And if they are interesting, they're interesting in a kind of quasi-mythical way. You know, the very exaggerated elements of idiolect and character that he gives you. You know, the doll's dressmaker, or even Lizzie Hexam, if you were thinking of her in Our Mutual Friend.
Yeah,
you know, they're painted much more broadly, almost as if they could be on the stage or something.
that's very interesting. I appreciate that, and I'll be thinking about it, because I kind of have just been treating all Victorian novels in the same category, but it's a time period and not a genre. And so from what you're saying, I'm kind of gathering, maybe think almost also kind of some fairy tale elements in his books, possibly.
Definitely.
Okay.
And although you sometimes find those even in Eliot or something, but they're muted in comparison with Dickens. Whom, I mean, G.K. Chesterton wrote a book about Dickens, oh gosh, way back, it's sort of 1902 or something, but it's still quite fresh in the way that he appreciates the way the characters kind of burst their generic markers almost. He talks about Mr. Pickwick, for example, as grotesque in the way that again, that he does kind of, he's sort of bigger than the novel almost, and that's often true of Dickens characters. And you sometimes see these 19th century paintings of Dickens writing and all the characters kind of around him, as if they had come to life as sort of archetypes or myths or something.
Yeah. Oh, this is very interesting. Yeah, I'll be reevaluating this. I'm currently finishing up. I did not enjoy A Tale of Two Cities when I read it, I think a decade ago, but I thought, you know what, I'm going to give it a second chance. And I have been enjoying it a lot more this second time around. So I'm glad to be revisiting it. And the entire plot line with Sidney Carton, I'm finding just, I'm very moved by that. And, you know, speaking of scriptural images, just, you know, no greater love has a man than he lays down his life for another. I can't remember the exact quote, but that's a very, very moving kind of story arc to me.
Yes, it is. And Dickens' whole take on religion was highly moral, and in terms of sort of self-sacrifice.
Yes. Yeah. Well, so something that you had two kind of bits in your bio that particularly leapt out at me. And so you've done some writing on Robert Louis Stevenson and Calvinism and the double. And I do not know what this exactly entails. So can you kind of elaborate on that?
Yes, certainly. In fact, I've got a graduate student who is writing about this in much more detail than I have.
Wow.
But I did start her off by a module where I made them look at some of Robert Louis Stevenson's short stories, in particular Jekyll and Hyde and Markheim, which are two stories about different kinds of doubles. In terms of St. Paul in Romans, in particular in relation to Jekyll and Hyde, you know, the good I would do, I do not, that which I would not do, that I do, this kind of tornness. And I did want people to start looking at a lot of Scottish writing, James Hogg as well, who's a bit earlier than the Victorian period, in relation to Calvinism. Stevenson, his parents were kind of moderate Calvinists, moderate Presbyterians, but his nurse was a hellfire Calvinist. And I think what I argue about Jekyll and Hyde is that Calvinism, in its sort of classic form, has this very strong idea of double predestination. I used to show the students various kind of little outlines. There's one by Bunyan, The Map of Salvation, where you've got this idea that you examine yourself as a Calvinist to find if you have an effectual calling. And sometimes things like doubt, which in Lutheranism and Fectum, you know, kind of throws you on Christ and is, you know, doubt is almost the way to salvation. Doubt can often be a sign of reprobation. So there is this sense in which you are kind of split as a person while you're trying to decide about your salvation. If you read Bunyan's own Grace Abounding, you can see lots and lots of debate about this in his own writings. And so when it comes to Robert Louis Stevenson, he moves on beyond Calvinism, but can also be seen to be kind of questioning this kind of split self in Jekyll and Hyde, because the problem that Jekyll has is that he has good impulses and he has bad ones. And instead of finding some way to mediate between them and to accept the reprobate side, he still wants to keep this kind of Calvinist split. And so he hives off all the evil onto Mr. Hyde. But of course, what he's left with is not pure goodness, because it's impossible to do that. And this is his downfall. Whereas in fact, there is the aptly named Gabriel Utterson, who is waiting there, who is somebody who never gives up on people, however bad they are, and could have helped him to kind of integrate and acknowledge the evil in himself, but he doesn't. And I see this as Stevenson offering a kind of critique of Calvinism, but at the same time looking at Calvinism and seeing that the fact that we are protean selves inside. So at the end of Jekyll and Hyde, Mr. Jekyll says that he has learned that man is not one, but two, a whole polity of multifarious denizens. And it's how you deal with that Calvinist anthropology that I think is a key to a lot of Stevenson's work. Just as I said, I've got a graduate student who's taking it a lot further than me. But I have a chapter, he does come into my God and the Gothic book. I think he gets a bit of a chapter on Scottish Gothic, where I look at Markheim and Jekyll and Hyde.
I have not read Markheim, but that's going to shoot up to the top of my list then.
Well, I'm not going to give away the plot, but it's the other side of Jekyll and Hyde. It's like another version only a redemptive one.
Oh, how interesting. Yes, this is something that I've noticed. I told you earlier that I'm now Lutheran, and kind of being a sacramentalist, it is does really kind of ease some of those doubts. That it's a ramification of Calvinism that I didn't even realize until as an adult now being Lutheran. I think, oh, this is what the sacraments are about. And yeah, it's been very liberating.
That's very interesting. Yes, that the material world can signify, which I think is partly what's at stake in a novel like Dracula, which is full of sacramental language, actually. That somehow the vampiric state stops the body from being able to mediate the spiritual. It traps you in a whole material world that cannot speak in the way that the natural decaying body can. That is sacramental.
And so I guess sometimes I hear theories about kind of sexuality being represented in Dracula. Do you think that can also be there, or you don't really see it as much?
Well, the sex stuff is all on the surface. You don't have to dig for it. It's not something that, you have to reveal. Gosh. But again, I think too easily do people say, oh, look, Lucy as a vampire is now sexually liberated.
Yes.
Oh, but she's not sexually liberated. She's going around killing children.
Yeah,
This is not a kind of way of human flourishing.
No. Yeah, she's a slave to that. So that's interesting, the spiritual element. Yeah, I'll be thinking on that. And then I guess is Treasure Island kind of purely just a good old adventure story, or are there deeper elements you notice in that?
I suppose there are questions of what it is to be human. I think they're more pronounced in Kidnapped. I think Kidnapped is a deeper text in relation to looking at religious ideas, because you've got very much the boy who represents lowland Protestant values, and Alan Breck, who represents the Jacobite romantic Catholicism, and they're kind of played out against each other, or they're seen to sort of, that you somehow need both, that together they make sense.
Yeah. Oh, very interesting.
So again, you've got this sort of duality coming out, and this idea of integration, which is sort of less pronounced in Treasure Island.
Yes.
So I need to go back and look at Treasure Island. I've just been on holiday to the very northernmost island of the Shetlands, which is called Unst. And Stevenson's father and uncle were involved in looking after and earlier members of the family building the lighthouse there. And it was pointed out in the tourist literature that Treasure Island's map is based on the island of Unst. So it would be very interesting to know, whether there isn't anything going on there in relation to Scotland in Treasure Island that I hadn't really thought about, but I haven't investigated that.
Yes. Oh, that is so interesting. Yeah, I was just blown away by Treasure Island. I read it a few years ago, and I think Long John Silver is just one of the most interesting characters out there, that you are really second guessing what you think about him throughout the entire book.
Absolutely. And he's quite good at that kind of move, and the sense of giving a kind of depth. I have a feeling he wrote a kind of fable. He wrote a whole series of little fables, and I think Long John Silver as a character kind of appears in one of those. But yes, he's very dark and mysterious, and you can't understand his. Again, he almost stands in for a kind of Calvinist God, the unknown God, the God who is pure will.
Very interesting. Yeah, actually, someone recommended to me, and I was so glad I ended up reading it, The Lighthouse Stevensons by, oh, I can't remember the author's name, but that is just, it's so dynamically written. I'm not usually a topical nonfiction. I like kind of memoirs and biographies, but I was hooked from the beginning. Yeah, just all of the obstacles that they went through just to put up these lighthouses. And then, speaking of Calvinists too, they said that, people were opposed to the lighthouses being put up because then they couldn't, take from these ships that were crashing, and even sometimes the pastors would, as the ship was out there, and if it was on a Sunday morning, they would pray that the ship would wreck, so they could have the goods. Yes.
It's appalling. I know Sabine Baring Gould did a lot of work to stop it on the North Devon Cornish border coast. They even sometimes used to hold lights to mislead the ships, which seems horrendous.
Yes. Well, you do not know it, but you have solved a mystery for me now, because I read In the Roar of the Sea by Sabine Baring Gould, and I kept saying Sabine. And I kept asking, does anyone know? And nobody knew. So now, thank you for clarifying that for me, because it's a name I had never encountered before.
Wrong, but in England we do normally say Sabine Baring Gould when we talk about his hymns and things, as in the Sabine women who of course get raped. whether he pronounced it like that, I'm not sure. I don't know. It's just the way I've always heard it pronounced.
Yes. Yes. Yeah, and he does something really interesting in The Roar of the Sea. There is a character who is mentally delayed, and someone takes advantage of that and has him hold a light up on the cliff so that a ship will wreck. That's the only
based on actual experiences. I mean, people were very, very poor.
Yes.
And I think we need to remember that these are people who are on the absolute, sort of a breadline. And it had often been, there were lots of pirates around Cornwall till quite late on.
Yes. Are there any novels of Sabine Baring Gould that particularly stick out to you as must reads?
The novels quite kind of, the ones that I've read are quite linked to folklore. I've read some really lovely short stories by him of a slightly kind of Gothic-y sort. I'm trying to remember the name of it now. There's one, is it called Marjorie something? I read one about a kind of vampire who lives on the top of a church tower on Brent Tor on Dartmoor, and she gets rescued by someone who goes to ring the bell for the Christmas services, and she kind of feeds off him, so she then becomes younger and he becomes older.
Oh, wow.
It's told in a very matter-of-fact folklore way, but it's a tour de force.
Wow. Oh, that sounds so fascinating.
I think he was very, very good at working with local folklore. And certainly the novels that I've read are good on that, but they are, you have to be quite interested in Devon folklore to really kind of, it's not quite Lorna Doone or something.
Yes.
You're obviously doing very well if you're reading, you enjoy them.
Yeah, well, it was just a really special book. It had kind of the light and dark that Dickens has, but the atmosphere of kind of a Thomas Hardy, and the characterization of a Gaskell. It was just a masterpiece. And I can't believe it's now been a year since I've read, a novel by him. And I keep thinking I need to, because it was just such a delight. And I was in kind of a reading rut, and it pulled me right out.
That's brilliant. No, they do. They have this incredible sense of place, which really is Hardy-esque. And the
Yes.
place as an actor, as a character,
Yes.
is very, very strong.
And the church that is half buried in sand, what is that church?
Oh gosh, it's not St. Edilian. It's on the North Cornish coast.
Yes.
It may be St. Edilian, I can't quite remember.
I can't remember. But I loved In the Roar of the Sea, there's a wedding scene in that church. And at the end, everyone kind of pulls their boots off and dumps the sand out. And then they make their way out of the church.
Wonderful.
Yes. Yeah, it was very memorable.
Mm-hmm.
And then lastly, the other part that you had studied that particularly struck me was the portrayal of theology in Victorian ghost stories. And this is an element of Victorian ghost stories I hadn't looked for before, but I will be now.
I mean, I mentioned Margaret Oliphant. She has some of the greatest ghost stories of the period. And they are, well, they are wholly theological. They are partly about presenting the supernatural as real. So there's one, The Beleaguered City, about the town of Semur in Burgundy, where the dead of the city force the living out into the country and take over their old roles in the city because they feel that life has become so corrupt there. And the whole thing is narrated by the town mayor, who is an example of laicite, very much a kind of free thinker. He doesn't want to believe it, but it becomes real in the course of the story. Another very wonderful ghost story that she wrote, which has a kind of theological meaning, is called The Library Window, which is a very feminist work as well, about a young girl who sits in front of a window in St. Andrews in Scotland, called St. Rule in the novel. And she imagines a window on the other side where people tell her it's a false window. But gradually she sees more and more in the window. And then she sees a man writing, and it's partly a kind of meditation on the fact that she herself is a writer. And she sees in this ghostly figure her own vocation. But it's also a riff, as many Victorian ghost stories are, in my opinion, on 1 Corinthians 13:12. Now we see through a glass darkly, but then face to face. The idea that we see through, it's a pun in a sense, because obviously it's a mirror in St. Paul. But the word glass in English means both mirror and window. And so she is enabled to look through death to the afterlife in this story. And the whole thing is imagined with the utmost delicacy. But I would argue that an awful lot of Victorian ghost stories, Elizabeth Gaskell's ones, for example, have this need to both show the reality of the afterlife and also to suggest ideas of a kind of purgatory, which Protestants don't believe in. But in the 19th century, where they were beginning to question hell, they very often reached to Dante or to more Catholic understandings of a progressive afterlife, and build that into ghost stories. So you can see it in several of Elizabeth Gaskell's stories, The Old Nurse's Tale, the one about the nun.
The Grey Lady?
The name for the moment, I'm having a senior moment. But there's a whole series which do this, and George MacDonald does it in his kind of stories as well. which are more fantasy than ghost stories, but a lot of ghost stories are very interested in the idea of predicating some kind of redemption beyond death or lost people. I mean, the apogee of them all would be the scene in Wuthering Heights when Kathy is trying to get in through the window.
Yes.
This sort of lost soul outside trying to get in. But in many of the stories, there is something rather more positive. And it was interesting at Dickens, who tried to get Mrs. Gaskell to make the supernatural less real. But Mrs. Gaskell refused. I mean, Dickens has got a whole series of ghost stories called The Tale of a House that they did at Christmas, where nobody is haunted by anything more than memory.
Oh, interesting.
But there are a whole number of ghost story writers who do question this. And obviously by the end of the century, you're getting Vernon Lee, M.R. James, all these kind of people who again have a very active supernatural in the ghost story. So I think they're very much a way of exploring boundaries between life and death, boundaries between redemption and damnation, all the way through the period. And it's interesting that in the Gothic novels of the late 18th century, you very often get the explained supernatural. They're kind of Enlightenment texts that want to almost demythologize the supernatural. But in the Victorian period, you get a return of a real supernatural in the ghost story. Arthur Marken would be another writer who has real theological interest in doing this.
Oh, I have not heard of him, so I will definitely be looking him up.
1890s. The Three Impostors is a famous one. Another one is The Great God Pan.
Oh, okay. I have heard of that story.
But he wrote short supernatural stories as well. Sometimes they're about sort of relics from the past that are still hanging around. Or they're about demonic forces trying to take people over. But he believed that even if you had a kind of evil supernatural, it was somehow a way of importing the holy back into the material world.
So it sounds like kind of even with all of the study and analysis and teaching you've done, that you still very much can just enjoy Victorian literature as a reader as well.
I do. I'm afraid I still love it.
No, I think that's wonderful.
And reading, broadly across European literature as well. But no, and I can still reread Wilkie Collins or Anthony Trollope or all sorts of people and get great pleasure from it.
Yes. Yeah, that's really wonderful to hear. I'm also going to be doing an interview with someone from the Trollope Society. So that will be fun. Now, he is an author who I've read only 10. It's so funny to say only 10, but when you think about how much he wrote, it is only 10. Yes. And I continue to be conquered by Can You Forgive Her? So I have not read through the Palliser series yet. But I've heard that Can You Forgive Her is maybe the least strong out of that series. So to persevere and keep going.
I think it is worth it. I mean, I do think Mrs. Oliphant stands up quite well against Trollope. Sometimes they're quite quick. I know they seem quite long. I'm looking at some Trollopes in front of me and thinking, oh, well, yes, the Last Chronicle of Barset, that is actually quite long. Whereas, things like The Warden are really, you're through in no time, or even Barchester Towers, they are very kind of quick and easy to sort of whiz through. I like the political ones as well. I think they're good. And the psychology, particularly of things like the Prime Minister, is very good. But I do like quite a lot of kind of very popular Victorian fiction. I like Rider Haggard, for example. I've mentioned Wilkie Collins. I'm just looking along my shelves now.
Yeah, I haven't yet read Rider Haggard, but I think I might start with She. Do you think She is a good one to start with?
A good one.
Okay.
He's got a whole series about Zulu culture, though, which are really quite interesting.
Yes.
Looking at the kind of African experience from inside, which is interesting.
So he did travel. He did travel and like spend time in Africa.
I don't know quite how much time he did spend, or how much of it is kind of armchair.
Yeah.
Actually, but then of course even the anthropologists of the time are armchair anthropologists. We haven't quite reached the days of Malinowski. You know, Fraser, for example, he didn't do anything from a distance. And I mean, Haggard was often working from these kind of, you know, sort of anthropological kinds of texts. So I don't know how far it is in terms of kind of witnessing that kind of period.
Yes. Oh, well, this has all been so interesting, and thank you so much for taking the time to speak with me.
It's a pleasure. It's lovely to speak to somebody who reads so much Victorian literature. I'm sure you read more than I do.
Well, I mean, I have my gaps, so slowly working on improving that. But yes, so I will definitely include the book titles down below in case people want to read more.
Brilliant. Thanks very much.